Welcome to the Hillsdale College Online Courses Podcast. I'm Jeremiah Regan.
And I'm Juan Davalos, and we're here today with a new course, The History of Classical Music, Pythagoras through Beethoven.
And we're joined today by Michael Eller, who is an operations fellow for Hillsdale College Online Courses. That means he kind of does everything we need to help produce these courses, and he worked on this course, The History of Classical Music. He's also a concert violinist, and we're pleased to have him with us today.
Hello, I'm glad to be here.
Welcome, Michael. And Michael is also a recent graduate of Hillsdale College, and I think you majored in music, correct?
That is correct.
We brought some firepower with us for this intro.
That's right. While Jeremiah and I really appreciate classical music and love listening to it, we brought Michael because he could help us understand it a little better.
He's also going to help us answer the question of why do a course on classical music?
Because classical music and music in general is the highest of all art forms.
So that's interesting. When we think about what makes a human unique, one of the common answers, and it's sensible, is that human beings can think and can use reason and words, but classical music does something different than what words can do.
Yeah, so music can communicate to the human soul and bring out emotions and feelings that sometimes words can't even do. And you'll experience sensations when listening to a great piece of music that you will never experience when reading or hearing someone talk to you.
And I think that's really what Professor Hyperion Knight, who leads this course, brings out. He discusses some of the technical developments that allowed classical music to grow and burgeon into the beautiful art form that it is. But he also, in this course, explains how this music touches the soul, and then he demonstrates it because he's actually playing some of these pieces in between his explanations.
And in this first lecture, we'll actually learn how we essentially got classical music and the process that the development of music took to get there. In fact, that's the title of the lecture, The Development of Music. And it starts all the way back with Pythagoras, which I've always heard about the connection between mathematics and music, and I've never really quite understood it. And this lecture really helped me understand why. What is it that Pythagoras discovered and how the chromatic scale was developed, and it really increases your appreciation of the art.
Michael, you're an accomplished musician. When you first started learning, you learned scales and harmonies and those types of things. That's kind of where you have to start, right?
Yeah. So I started on piano at the age of 4 with my mom, who is an accomplished pianist. And you start with the basics of technique and scales and arpeggios. And without those things, you don't have the great pieces of music like, Beethoven's Fifth Piano Concerto, which literally opens with a bunch of arpeggios.
What's an arpeggio?
An arpeggio is a broken up scale. So instead of playing each note stepping up, you skip and you outline the key of the scale. So if you're playing a C major scale, you would usually play on the piano C, D, E, F, G, and so on. So instead you go C, E, G, and that outlines your major triad within the C major scale.
These types of developments are what Professor Knight helps us to understand. Professor Hyperion Knight is a distinguished fellow of Hillsdale College and a concert pianist. If you want to get the full benefit out of this course, I would encourage you to check out our website, online.hillsdale.edu. There you can watch the lectures. You'll be able to see Professor Knight play at the piano. You'll be able to see musical overlays that show the staff and notes. Read our study guides that provide references to all of the pieces of music that are played. And if you really just like to listen, you can put the course on audio-only mode, put your smartphone in your pocket, go about your business, and the site will track your progress, and you can go back and take quizzes to check your knowledge. So go to the website at online.hillsdale.edu. That's online.hillsdale.edu.
That really is one of the funnest things we've done, I think, putting the staff above the piano as it's playing and seeing the notes that are being recorded. I really love how online courses did that with this particular course. I think it really increases the learning experience for people.
You can play along at home.
And now let's turn to Hyperion Knight in Lecture 1, The Development of Music.
Classical music. It can soothe the soul and elevate the spirit. It can make us laugh or weep. It can make us fall in love or march into combat. But what is it exactly? We'll be exploring that question together, but let me open with a spoiler. It is one of the most astonishing achievements of civilization. My name is Hyperion Knight, and music has been my lifelong passion. I'm a teaching fellow at Hillsdale College, and it will be my privilege to take you on a tour of classical music, in which I hope to make clear how truly remarkable this achievement is. Where did the inspiration for all this great music come from? And why do we call it classical? For that matter, what do we really mean when we say that music is great? Aren't we told that beauty is in the eye of the beholder? Great music, or great art of any kind really, is that which stands the test of time. If artworks are still cherished long after the generation for which they are written, they have achieved greatness, and they become classics. But again, why classical? The classical era refers to the Greek and Roman civilizations of antiquity, anywhere from 8th century BC to 8th century AD. Classical means the Roman Colosseum and the Parthenon in Athens. It's a valid question, and we'll find the answers when we get to the classical period that is central to great music, the era of Haydn, Mozart, and Beethoven. But for now, what we mean by classical music is Western art music, the explosion of musical genius that erupted in the Baroque era after the fuse was lit in medieval and Renaissance Europe. It's important to point out, of course, that there are many kinds of music outside of Western civilization, and the ancient cultures have their own body of music they consider classical. World music is a vast, fascinating, and wonderful universe full of its own treasures, but those treasures often use different scales than we do. And for our purposes, classical music will refer to music that uses the scales that are available to us on this instrument, the piano. Both the 52 white notes and the 36 black notes. Even with these basic definitions in place, there are still vast gray areas, and these will become ever more apparent as we approach the 20th century with its riches of classic jazz, classic musical theater, even classic rock. But as we'll see, this vast profusion of jazz and modern music, even though it borrows from sources all over the world, is still rooted in the traditions we'll be studying. And those roots go back thousands of years. Now, as a sort of time machine back to the ancient roots of music, I'd like to propose a thought experiment. If you were to ask the typical well-educated person who appreciates culture to name a couple of Renaissance painters, they'd probably have no trouble. The names Michelangelo and Leonardo da Vinci might pop out instantly. But if you were to ask them to name a couple of Renaissance composers, you might very well get a blank stare. The average person might know a Renaissance song, like Greensleeves, that Queen Elizabeth I attributed to her father, Henry VIII. And a number of traditional Christmas carols date all the way back to medieval times. No doubt, there were many composers of great genius before the Baroque era. But unless we actively seek out the world of early music, we rarely encounter them in the concert world. Why is this? We have countless magnificent sculptures and masterpieces of architecture that we revere today. The classic literature of Greece goes all the way back to the epic poems of Homer in the 8th century BC. For that matter, Aristotle and Plato are still relevant today. But when it comes to ancient Greek music, we actually don't really even know what it sounded like. The fact of the matter is, in some ways, music lagged behind the other arts, and not just by centuries, but by millennia. And the reason for this is nothing short of mind-boggling. From the time music was first understood mathematically and formalized as a branch of science, it then took over 2,000 years to figure out how to properly tune a scale on a keyboard. 2 millennia. It's an astounding story that includes a mix of superstition, tastes that changed over centuries, and crucially, the need for advanced mathematics. And in the middle of all that, we had to figure out how to write the music down. Now, the ancients probably did get a pretty good handle on what we consider the 8 white notes of the C major scale. But those 5 black notes in between, the greatest minds of science, music, and philosophy struggled with those for centuries. So let's go back to the origins of music. We credit the invention of the science of music to Pythagoras. Yes, that Pythagoras, the same guy who devised the Pythagorean theorem of right triangles, because he was the one who first understood the mathematical relations between the notes. He recognized that what we call an octave, or a perfect eighth, 8 notes apart, is actually a 2-to-1 ratio. Now, many of you will already know that we define the note A as 440, which means that if you strike it, or bow it, or pluck it, the note will vibrate 440 times per second to make the pitch. Pythagoras realized that if you had a string twice as long, it would then vibrate at half the speed, 220, and the note would sound almost identical to our ear, but an octave lower. And likewise, a string twice as short would then vibrate at twice the speed, 880, and again give us an almost identical note, only an octave higher. You can just imagine his excitement as he went on to the next interval, from 2-to-1 to 3-to-2, and discovered what we call the perfect fifth, 5 notes apart. Well, no reason to stop there. He then went on to the next interval and discovered what we call the perfect fourth, 4 notes apart. Among his many talents, Pythagoras was a philosopher who started his own mystical cult, a deeply moral community that forbid outrages like the eating of fava beans, or the sacrificing of a white rooster, or numbers that stretch out to infinity, called irrational numbers. For his followers, the numbers were as sacred as the air they breathed. And this faith of his told him that these perfect musical ratios were divinely ordered. They came from on high and they were sacred. But the faith of Pythagoras in these numbers proved to be both a blessing and a curse for civilization. It was a blessing as long as the numbers all added up. But what if they stopped adding up? Let's find out. Pythagoras created his own system of tuning, and Pythagorean tuning was indeed a godsend as long as you knew when to stop. For his tuning system, he used the interval of the fifth. So let's see what happens. If we start on F and we proceed up the circle of fifths, we then get a C, then a G, D, A, E, B. And voila, we now have all 7 of the white notes needed for a scale. If you start on C and go to the C 8 notes above, the octave above, you get what we call a C major scale. If you start on the A, you get what we call a natural minor scale. And you can get a lot of very enjoyable, but not terribly sophisticated music from these 7 notes. So far, so good. But what if you don't stop after 7 notes? Let's find out. We'll start on the lowest C of the piano, and again, follow what we call the circle of fifths up. Starting on C, we then get a G, then a D, then an A, E, B, then F sharp. Aha, the first black note. Then C sharp, then G sharp, D sharp, A sharp, and then E sharp. But what's this? It looks like an F natural, but it's an E sharp. And then the last one is B sharp, which of course to any sober person looks like a C natural. So at the end of this circle of fifths, we wind up at a B sharp that should be exactly the same as C natural, but it's not. The math has diverged. The 2-to-1 ratio of the octaves does not sync up with the 3-to-2 ratio of the fifths. And the same is true of fourths, as well as major thirds at 5-to-4. It's turtles all the way down. The tragic, harsh reality is that, like Gödel's incompleteness theorem, there is no way to have a piano in which all the notes are perfectly in tune with each other. And Pythagoras knew this. Now, not being able to access all 12 notes of what we call the chromatic scale, meaning the 7 white notes plus the 5 black notes, meant that music was limited for the time being. But how did this situation drag on for over 2,000 years? Well, for the first 1,000 years or so, we can chalk it up to superstition. There was no way the followers of Pythagoras or Aristotle were going to deal with the problem of tuning the black notes because it would require what we call tempering them, meaning tampering with them to alter their pure ratios and turn them into irrational numbers. Numbers that went on forever, like pi, numbers that were not divinely sanctioned. And there was no way any decent, God-fearing pagan would tolerate that. After the fall of Rome, Christianity would eventually prove to be more tolerant. But first they had a bigger problem to deal with. You see, because the notes weren't actually written down, nobody was entirely sure what they were supposed to be singing in the first place. A powerful ruler was required to deal with this situation, and that man was Charles the Great, known as Charlemagne in Frankish. Now, Charlemagne united much of Europe in what would become a new Holy Roman Empire. But, much to his chagrin, he discovered that Christian hymns sounded completely different from church to church. So he got together with his father, who was named Pepin the Short, and they decided that to unify Europe, they would have to make the chanting of the monks plain, simple enough that everybody could learn the same notes. And this new plain chant essentially distilled music. It purified it down to just a single note at a time so that everyone could sing the same notes. There was no need to worry about tuning the notes for the time being, and with a saintly genius like Hildegard of Bingen, this modal music was downright inspirational.
Hey there! Today I want to tell you about the Hillsdale K-12 Classical Education Podcast. This unique show explains how children benefit from an American classical education. Whether you're a teacher, student, or parent, you'll find something of value on the show. You'll hear from teachers and administrators from schools around the country, as well as Hillsdale professors and friends who are leading the effort to revive the American tradition of K-12 education. When you listen, you'll learn all about classical education, what it is, how to teach it, and why it matters today. And there are dozens of back episodes on specific topics, like teaching Singapore math, reading great books, and even understanding how athletics is critical to a child's development. Listen every Monday on podcast.hillsdale.edu. That's podcast.hillsdale.edu or wherever you find your audio.
But even with lovely plain song like this, an Italian monk whose job it was to teach the notes, Guido of Arezzo, had decided he'd had enough. And around 1000 AD, he created sheet music. He created a musical staff and named the notes, what we now call do, re, mi, fa, sol, la, ti, do, finally ending all the confusion. And now that the monks could finally read the notes, they cut loose. They started harmonizing. At first, they added just one voice, like an organ playing along with them. And this organum used the harmonies of Pythagorean intervals, the fourths and fifths. So in Gregorian chant, monks might sing along in parallel fifths, an effect Franz Liszt would imitate centuries later for its Gothic effect. And then a remote island got in on the act. And in Britain, the monks started harmonizing in thirds. Now, this sounded terrible to the rest of Europe because to them, this Pythagorean interval was way out of tune. So they told the British that they weren't really singing. They were howling in thirds. They said it sounded more like shouting than singing. Well, to our ears, with our modern tuning, this makes no sense at all. The third is the most natural and beautiful way to harmonize. You can add thirds to anything. For instance, I can take the Chopin Minute Waltz and add all the thirds I want. So, harmonizing in thirds became all the rage, and it began to dawn on people that they eventually would have to temper all the notes evenly. They would have to make every single note slightly out of tune with its pure ratio, but at least they'd all be out of tune equally. And then another development made a final reckoning with tuning inevitable. Our friend Guido of Arezzo in Italy had, of course, created a musical staff, but also a clef, meaning a key, to show where middle C is on the piano. In the alto clef, this is used by violas and alto singers who tend to be in the middle range of a chord. But this raised havoc for the boy sopranos who wanted to sing in the treble range. And so for them, a treble range was created, a treble clef that went from G to G. And the treble clef sign is the ornate medieval letter G that surrounds the line for G, a note above middle C. And so if you sang from G to G, you now had a problem with the notes from F to G because that was a whole step with half a step in between, unlike B to C in the C major scale. So the sharp sign was created, which is actually the letter F to remind the boy sopranos that they have to sharpen the F up to an F sharp to make a proper major scale. And then the grown men whose voices had already changed piped up. Hold your horses, they said. We can't sing in either of those clefs. So the bass clef was created for the basses, and they were allowed to sing from the line F. The bass clef sign is the ornate medieval letter F that surrounds the line for F below C. But again, there was a problem with B and C. It was only a half step. So the flat sign was created to remind the basses they had to flatten the B to create a proper major scale starting on F. So the black notes all became sharps and flats, depending on what key you were in, and music started to shift from a modal system to a tonal system, and the implications were huge. We now had the grand staff for writing music. We had black notes that were now sharps and flats, and we also had evolving scales as the Gregorian modes changed into major and minor keys. The stage was set for Armageddon, the final conflict over temperament, whether or not to tamper with each and every note so that it was tolerably out of tune with its neighbor. And this was a battle royal that amazingly embroiled all the founders of modern science. Sir Isaac Newton sided with Pythagoras. He was so devoted to the perfect 7-note ratios that when he invented the science of optics, he actually invented a 7th color, indigo, so that the number of colors in the rainbow would match the number of notes in the scale. And Johannes Kepler was with him as well. He decided that the elliptical orbits he had discovered for planets were actually perfect Pythagorean ratios, and he called it the music of the spheres. But Even these supreme geniuses were no match for the work done by a lute player from Italy and his little boy. Vincenzo Galilei in late Renaissance Florence had been laying the groundwork for great music. He and his Florentine camerata had decided they wanted a renaissance in music, just like the rest of the arts. So Vincenzo got together with his little boy, who was named Galileo Galilei, and the two of them set about measuring pitch tension and string tension to determine the best method of tuning. Now, Vincenzo then went on to teach his son Galileo that abstract mathematics wasn't enough. It had to measure real-world phenomena, measure change over time, and in the process, they created the first nonlinear mathematical equation in history. Now, I'm applying something rather strongly here, so let me just come right out and say it. Yes, the modern science of physics resulted, in part, from trying to properly tune a scale on an ancestor of the guitar. Vincenzo came up with a well-tempered solution in which he was able to play pieces in all 24 keys, starting with the 12 notes of the chromatic scale in both major and minor. And with this, we are almost ready to say goodbye to the Renaissance, because the father and son team of Galilei had come up with the tools needed for the Baroque era, heralding a tsunami of musical and scientific genius. And the incomparable composers, Handel, Scarlatti, and Bach, were all born in the same year. The great Johann Sebastian Bach then planted his flag in the sand with two monumental sets of 24 preludes and fugues he called the Well-Tempered Clavier. Now, for our purposes, his title, the Well-Tempered Clavier, means the well-tuned keyboard. And Bach's masterpiece was both music and manifesto. He would now demonstrate what was possible now that it was possible to play in all of the keys by writing a prelude and fugue in every single key. He starts with his famous prelude in C major. Followed by a fugue in C major. The mood then changes as he gives us a prelude in C minor. Followed by its catchy fugue. And then we move from C up to C sharp. Followed by its fugue in C sharp. And then the mood once again darkens as Bach takes us into C sharp minor. Followed by its fugue, which is neo-modal. And then, of course, Bach moves from C sharp up to D. And then all the way up the rest of the 12 notes in both major and minor. With the advent of tonality, music now took its equal place with the other arts. Bach's fugues are the highest form of counterpoint, with different voices imitating each other. But counterpoint, meaning musical lines acting independently, had already reached dizzying heights of complexity in the Renaissance. The Franco-Flemish genius Josquin had raised contrapuntal polyphony, meaning many voices, to an absolute science, as in his popular motet Ave Maria. And in Rome, High Renaissance master Palestrina had even made the more conservative polyphony of the Counter-Reformation an important addition to anointing new popes. The fugues of Bach then integrated this sophisticated polyphony with a new tonal paradigm, and this made it possible to have fascinating variations on the fugue subject itself. For instance, in the C-sharp major fugue, the subject first enters on a G sharp. Then it comes in on a C sharp. Then G sharp again. Then it goes into minor. So as a result, the fugues are full of rich, harmonic, and other kinds of variation on the fugue subject itself. The 24 major and minor keys made musical structures possible, architecture and sound, and Bach and others started creating Gothic cathedrals and sound. Where Notre Dame in Paris was supported by flying buttresses, the Bach Mass in B minor was undergirded by harmonic structures and a tonal center, unlike anything the world had ever heard. But we're getting a little ahead of ourselves. You see, Vincenzo Galilei wasn't finished yet. There are many ways to think about the Italian Renaissance, but I like to imagine it as a duel between the cities of Venice and Florence to be king of the arts, including music. Venice got off to an early lead, and because they had all these musicians who couldn't really hear or see each other very well, if they wanted them to play slowly, they told them to be at ease, adagio, or walking, andante. If they wanted them to play fast, they told them to be happy, allegro, or quick, presto. If they wanted the music to get louder, they told them it was growing, crescendo, or shrinking, diminuendo. And Italian has remained the language of music ever since. But the birthplace of the Renaissance, Florence, was not about to be outdone. Papa Galilei and his Florentine camerata put their heads together, and they figured out why theater had been so popular in ancient Greece. It turned out that the words to the dramas had actually been sung. So, Florence invented opera. They created operas which were theatrical works, and I do mean works. Opera is the plural of the Italian word opus, which means work. Operas were theatrical works in which the dialogue was sung as recitative. And with that, Florence now overtook Venice again, at least temporarily. The first true Baroque masterpiece arrived in 1607, an opera by Claudio Monteverdi that told the story of Orpheus. His opera L'Orfeo was about Orpheus descending to the underworld to rescue his love Eurydice. And with L'Orfeo, we at last see the modern world of the Baroque emerging in the beauty of Monteverdi's drama. Majestic and highly ornate, the Baroque era was a godchild of the Renaissance. And the new style, this new Baroque style, would spread through Europe like wildfire. And the next century and a half would see stunning musical and technical innovations at every turn. Great music had now arrived in force.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Hillsdale College Online Courses podcast. If you want to continue learning about classical education or other topics, please visit hillsdale.edu/course. There you will find over 40 free online courses, including Constitution 101, The Real American Founding, American Citizenship and Its Decline, and many more. The courses include additional readings, study guides, fully produced videos, and you can chat with your fellow students on a dedicated forum. Upon completing a course, you will also get a certificate. All our courses are free because we believe that a virtuous citizen is the best defense for liberty. So pursue the education necessary for freedom and happiness at hillsdale.edu/course today. That's hillsdale.edu/course. Thanks for listening.